Taiwan is the biggest flashpoint in US-China relations, and people here in Taiwan are wondering how Joe Biden and Donald Trump would support Taiwan if they're elected. Now with me here today is Seton Hall law professor Maggie Lewis. She is on the Task Force for U.S. Policy on Taiwan for the Washington think tank Center for Strategic and International Studies. So Maggie, it's great to have you here.
Always good to be back.
Yeah, it's great to have you here in Taiwan. And also we want to know about what you think about these two candidates and their policy towards Taiwan. So let's start with Joe Biden.
Yeah, and we don't have a clear sort of list of these are the 5 or 6 things I would do, but I think we can glean a lot from his more general foreign policy statements. You know, I'm happy when I hear free and open Indo-Pacific because that shows a commitment to making sure that Taiwan, as part of the first island chain, is free and fair and not in Beijing's hands. I think it's important too to hear what he said about getting troops stationed back in Japan and Korea and really having a presence in the region on the military side. And as someone who specializes in human rights and criminal justice, I'm really happy to hear about putting human rights and democracy and working with our partners, sort of the like-mindeds, Australia, Canada, other countries that share deep democratic values, which of course is good for support of Taiwan.
We've seen actually in Trump's administration an increase of support for Taiwan in U.S. Congress, passing some of the laws. And even this week, there's some laws proposed, you know, the Taiwan Relations Reinforcement Act. There have been different laws proposed to increase U.S. support for Taiwan at a time when China is becoming more aggressive. But in the past, Biden has proposed more strategic ambiguity in terms of how to defend Taiwan, not being so clear. So where do you think Biden stands in terms of how to support Taiwan if China attacks Taiwan?
Right. I think when you look back, if you look at someone's statements back in like 2001 or 2002, that was such a different time. It was different for Taiwan. I mean, certainly under Chen Shui-bian, I think there were some different concerns about the U.S., about what kind of policy pronouncements might come out of Taiwan. And certainly it was a very different time with concerns about where China stood militarily and politically. We were in, when you had Jiang Zemin and then going into Hu Jintao, that was a very different political situation than under Xi Jinping. And also militarily, there wasn't really the ability to have force projection like today. So I'm always cautious to say, because someone said something about Taiwan even 5 or 10 or even further in the past, that it tells us what they would do today. I do think that Biden has some very good advisors on East Asia and China, and I trust that he's someone who respects expertise, and that bodes well for being a good listener and hopefully being open to understanding why Taiwan matters so much to the United States going forward. Now with Trump, it is true that there's been a lot of support in the executive branch and also in Congress. Now the executive branch, of course, we've seen a lot of changes in who is in Trump's cabinet, and I'm always wary, especially given Trump's transactional and mercurial nature, about what a second Trump administration would bring. I don't think we can extrapolate from any of the current support and say that would necessarily continue. And Congress, though, that's separate. And I think that we've had support for Taiwan for a long time, and that is accelerating. But now we need to deepen that support. So it's not just the traditional friends of Taiwan, but making sure that some of the younger members of Congress and newer members of Congress understand.
Yeah, you mentioned Trump not being too reliable, actually. I mean, that is actually one of the sentiments that people in Taiwan have. I think in a recent survey, 59% said they don't trust him, even though they think that he has benefited Taiwan in his term. So do you think that Trump is using Taiwan just as, you know, a pawn, a chip in relations with China?
And we've seen such a change with the pandemic because in the early part of the Trump administration, there was such an emphasis on the trade deal or the trade deals and, you know, whatever that was going to be. And then certainly since COVID, we've seen the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration be much more anti-China and not so economically transactional. And even in the debate, the one that we have had so far, phrases like the China plague. I mean, this is not someone who's looking to try to work with another country when that's the kind of language being used.
do you think that a second term with Trump would not necessarily bring the strong relations with Taiwan? What are your thoughts about that?
I just don't know what Trump's going to do between eating breakfast and lunch, let alone what he would do with Taiwan in a second term. So for me, I think that Taiwan benefits definitely from having a strong, stable hand in Washington, and I see that more from Biden than I do from Trump. And to be clear, the task force I'm on, we didn't choose sides. Our job was to explain why Taiwan is important to the United States and give ideas for how we could have some adjustments in U.S. policy towards Taiwan, regardless of who is in charge. And of course, that is important to see what the executive branch is doing. But as you noted, Congress is very much in this game. And we've had different kind of Taiwan bingo cards before. I mean, I think we need a new one for all the different acts, or potential bills pending in Congress.
There's a lot of great acts in Congress.
Yeah, and a lot of acronyms and a lot of language. So overall, we are seeing, I think, this kind of profusion of legislation that is both dealing with Taiwan directly and also concerns about China that, even if not directly speaking to Taiwan, has implications for the U.S., China, Taiwan triangular relationship.
So do you think this support for Taiwan, it's growing in Congress, is it bipartisan or is it more Republican than Democrat?
It is bipartisan. I mean, certainly we look at, just today we had Senator Rubio and Senator Merkley, a Democrat from Oregon and a Republican from Florida, introducing legislation together, and that is clear bipartisanship. For me, I do think traditionally there's been more support from the Republican side, although there is some deep Democratic support. What I hope for is bringing in more members of Congress to understand Taiwan. I don't just want to see Merkley, Rubio, Yoho, Cruz.
Right.
I also want to see AOC. I want to see Senator Booker. I want to see people who have not necessarily made Taiwan a priority to be educated about why it should be at least, if not the center of their, obviously they've got a lot of other issues to deal with, but more on their radar screen.
So why don't you make a case for Taiwan, because you're here doing that, right? And why is Taiwan important to the U.S.?
And there's multiple facets. First, as I said, militarily, I think this idea of the first island chain, most Americans would have no idea what that means. But thinking strategically that it matters dramatically whether Xi Jinping can launch a sub from the coast to the mainland or from the east coast of Taiwan, and what that would do from changing sort of the balance of power, especially as the PLA, the Chinese military, is growing in strength so quickly. And we do want to make sure that we have freedom of the seas, freedom of the air, and that we have the U.S. military showing they take their ships where international law allows, they take their planes where international law allows, and having those freedom of navigation operations and other ways of making the presence known. So militarily, it's important for our presence here. I think Taiwan economically is hugely important. We say often in the U.S. that TSMC is the largest company that Americans have never heard of, that semiconductors, which are so critical for our daily lives, but also strategically so important, and TSMC, which has said that it's going to build a plant in Arizona, so not only good for American jobs, but just for having that technical firepower and not have it, again, be controlled by Beijing is important. And then values. I mean, I said, I'm a law professor. I believe that if we say democratic values matter, human rights matter, you're not going to find a better example than Taiwan. I was here for the election in January, and our group of observers, which you don't need observers to come to Taiwan to show the election's free and fair, it's just because it's fun to come and be around for the election, but we went to an elementary school to watch the vote counting, and there was not a dry eye, even the...
Really?
Yeah, there's, because people were brought out their kids, and I think to see democracy in action, and particularly I was there with people who had been to Taiwan when it was under martial law. And so to see that transition and not just being in the transition, but now well past it, and how solidified democracy is here, was really just, it was a feel-good moment.
Now, I'm wondering about, U.S. policy changing to become more supportive of Taiwan, probably partly because of China, right? It's becoming more aggressive militarily, and the U.S. is more wary of Chinese tech products. All of this is going on. Do you think that this U.S. support is going to continue no matter who becomes president, or what are your thoughts about U.S. policy going forward?
It will continue. I think it's a question of just the strength of it, not that I don't see it dropping off. Again, there's just too many reasons to want to have a strong U.S.-Taiwan relationship. But one of the challenges is I don't want it to be that Americans are sort of pro-Taiwan because they're anti-China or they're concerned about China, but they also need to recognize Taiwan is the U.S.'s, I think, 11th trading partner right now. It fluctuates a little bit, but just how important Taiwan is in its own right to the United States, that it's not just a foil or something that we need to think of always in the cross-strait relationship dynamic. And I spent a lot of time in China. I went to Beijing to study the language in 1995. I was part of that group of people who were at the juncture where language learning was shifting from Taiwan to the mainland, and I think Taiwan is starting to get back some of those people-to-people ties, and that's also really important for long-term support of Taiwan.
What would you have to say to people in Taiwan who are a bit nervous about the U.S. elections and they don't know how U.S.-Taiwan relations will be going forward?
If you're only a bit nervous, then you're doing much better than most Americans. I have like the CNN anxiety when I turned it on in the morning and have no idea what has occurred overnight. But I mean, it is really it's sad to see where the U.S. is right now, and one reason I'm so grateful to be here, I'm always happy to be in Taiwan, is the absolutely stunning response to COVID. I mean, the Taiwan government and the Taiwan people have done a phenomenal job of pulling together, having a policy that works and sticking with it. And you contrast that with the U.S., and the difference is so stark. So I think there's a lot of anxiety just in general in the U.S., economically, culturally, health-wise. And so, yes, you're right to be nervous, but what we hope is that the election results will be clear. It'll be decided quickly, so we don't have a long period of uncertainty after November 3rd. And then, obviously, my preferences are clear. I hope that Biden and Harris can get to work and start making it so that we don't feel like there's so much uncertainty. But that's just my personal opinion.
Mm-hmm. And you do see U.S.-Taiwan relations going stronger moving forward?
And certainly they're very strong right now, so I think they're going to be, I don't know, sort of, feel like the dial, are we going to go up to 10 or 11? But I think what we need is not just strength, but smarts. And just saying we really support Taiwan, we really support Taiwan. Saying that over and over, those kind of declarations are part of a strategy. But I always say to my law students, don't just tell me, show me. So what are we going to do to show the support of Taiwan? Are we really going to see, for example, the U.S. working towards having a bilateral trade agreement? Because there's no doubt that the current trade arrangement is outdated. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be complicated, and it's going to take a lot of work. But that's the kind of work that needs to be done to show that this is a strong, durable relationship, and it's not just a bunch of fancy-sounding bills, which only really matter if they're passed and implemented in a thoughtful way.
So do you think that Biden would be moving forward with a trade agreement with Taiwan?
I think Biden and his team would certainly realize that what we have right now does not necessarily make sense, given both where Taiwan is as the U.S. is one of the top trading partners, and again with these strategic industries, particularly with semiconductors and other sort of high tech, where the more that the U.S. is rightfully wary about relying on components from China, that having Taiwan be a partner that we feel the national security concerns aren't there in the forefront. You always, of course, have to be thoughtful about any kind of trade, about are there national security issues or vulnerabilities. But my sense is that his team would recognize that there's a lot of benefits to making sure that the Taiwan-U.S. economic relationship is really strong.
Great. Well, Maggie, it's great to have you here in Taiwan, and we hope that your predictions are correct.
I do too.
I've been speaking with Seton Hall law professor Maggie Lewis. She's on the Task Force for U.S. Policy on Taiwan with the Center for Strategic and International Studies.